Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, because we're just a little past time, it is my great privilege and pleasure today to introduce our third panel. And I will introduce them in speaking order. First is Sugio Takahashi, and of course, their bios are eye-watering. They're awesome. These are some fascinating experts that we brought together today. And so I won't go through their entire bio, but just briefly to say a few words. Sugio is one of Japan's, if not Japan's, leading strategic thinker. He's brilliant. He is at the National Institute for Defense Studies, but more often at the Ministry of Defense in their policy planning division. And again, his expertise is on the U.S. Japan Alliance, amongst other things. Next will be Ms. Maeda from the PHP Institute. I love this name. It means peace and prosperity, peace and happiness through prosperity. She is an expert on China and on cross-strait relations. She was also recently a visiting fellow in Taiwan at National Sun Yat-sen University in Kaohsiung. And then we are very lucky to have Ms. Emma Chanlett-Avery from the Congressional Research Service. She is an expert on Japan, but also more broadly on the Asia-Pacific region, visiting us from Capitol Hill, and it's a pleasure to have her here. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Sugio.
Thank you. At first, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference, and I'm sorry that I could not meet the paper deadline to circulate my paper, and I'm still working. This is actually my fourth visit to DC in this year. That means 3 months, and my last visit was last week, and just to stay 1 day in DC. After this 12 hours flight from Tokyo to here, and the following then 14 hours flight from here to Tokyo. And this time, I have multiple conference, and because of generousness of the other Project 2049 and the Carnegie Endowment or other organization, I can stay 8 days. I have weekend, and so I really want to. I'm very looking forward to the rest of my stay in DC. And at least, before starting my briefing, I need to say one more thing. That is, my briefing is 100% based on the personal view, not to represent, NIDS or Japanese government or MOD's view. And first, actually, I have 2 or 3 questions from the Project 2049. First, the question is, implication of Chinese military modernization. And, I think the implication has two different sides, 2 different aspects. The first one is capability development side, and the other side is operational side. The capability development side is, this is very well known capability that is anti-access area denial capabilities, which we have already discussed. And the intention of the Chinese side would be to restrain or deter U.S. or Japanese military activities within East China Sea or South China Sea or Western Pacific. So this is a capability development side. And the other one is operational side. Not just if you look at the Chinese defense policy recently, not just a capability development. They have much more active operation in Western Pacific area or East China Sea area. Some of them does not contradict to existing international law, but some of them looks like to start a gradual challenge to the status quo. So this has some multiple aspects. And especially the maritime assets or air asset recently starts to, not recently actually, is now doing the active or assertive behavior. And as I said, some of them could be interpreted as a kind of fait accompli to change the status quo, or we are saying that the creeping expansion against the status quo. And in Japanese strategic committee's vocabulary, such kind of security challenge is now called as gray zone security challenge. And someone says sub-war situation. So this kind of gray zone security challenge is one of the very important challenge in the current situation and comes from the Chinese military modernization. And these two implications required us, gives us a very competing demand. If you just look at the anti-accessory denial capability, and if you need to prepare just for that, you can, just like some of the American strategists says, you should disperse your military asset, or in some cases you should retreat some of the military assets from the sphere of anti-accessory area denial threat, and to go in again in case of the contingency. So this is one of the, theoretical thought of counter anti-accessory denial capabilities. However, if you look at the creeping expansion side, operation side, then if you reduce your frontline asset to avoid the anti-accessory denial threat, then that would invite Chinese side creeping expansion. So in a sense, this is very competing demand. If you put more eggs on the front line, that could deter the creeping expansion. However, that egg will be very vulnerable in case of the contingency. So how do we find the best balance between these competing demands is very, very serious question for the current situation. And what Japanese side think about that, or what the alliance is thinking about that, is second part of my briefing, my presentation. And what Japan is thought is looking at the strategic document. Recently, Japanese government released two big strategic document. Just like American QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, Japanese government publishes National Defense Program Guideline. This is a counterpart of QDR. And the latest one is released in 2013, and the previous one was released in 2010. That means 2010 version was released in 2010 December. That means just 2 or 3 months after the first Senkaku crisis. The drunken fishermen came to the Senkaku area, and the second document, 2013, was just 1 and 3 months after of when Japanese government purchased Senkaku Islands from Japanese private citizen, and the Chinese government started to continuously send their government vessel to Senkaku area. So these two documents were drafted under the very similar, a little bit similar, but different strategic environment. And 2010 document strategy looks more on gray zone security challenge. And the bumper sticker of that document was dynamic defense force or dynamic deterrence. And dynamic deterrence means ISR-based deterrence. That means, if you have the continuous ISR activities in some areas to sensitize Chinese that they always watched over, then, they will be restrained from starting fait accompli like activities. This is the basic thought of 2010 NDPG. However, 2012 September situation, September event, again, when Japanese government decided to buy that land from Japanese private citizen, then China started to, in a sense, challenge the status quo. So ISR-based deterrence need to be, renewed. The Japanese government need more enhanced deterrence measures. And so the 2013 defense strategy has a new bumper sticker, that was a dynamic joint defense force or gray zone deterrence. And gray zone deterrence means in addition to ISR, flexible deterrent option or some kind of escalation control like operation option was introduced. That means, if the situation has been, if the situation changed, the document tells that the government should conduct, exercise, training, preposition in a manner to to send an effective signal to other countries. Of course, it doesn't specify China to send the signal to other countries, and so this kind of a kind of escalation control like thought is introduced in 2013, and in addition, very important aspect of 2013 defense strategy was that was drafted based on the capability assessment based on joint operation. That means, very similar to American capability-based planning. And the conclusion of that study was Japan's self-defense force should prioritize air and maritime superiority and strategic transportation capabilities for island defense. So these are the change of the Japanese strategic thought. And still, this looked at the gray zone thing, not necessarily sufficiently address how to counter the anti-accessory readiness threat. And so this is the continuous continuing debate. And and looking at the budget, not just the strategy, looking at the budget, the next fiscal year's Japanese defense budget is 4.8 trillion yen. Under the current currency rate, that is $40 billion. And good news is this is a record high Japanese defense budget. Bad news is record high is nominal term. If in real term, the past record high defense budget was 2003 or 4, and if you look at the inflation rate, still the New Year's defense budget is smaller than that one. So that tells basically Japanese defense budget is flat more than 10 years, and these more than 10 years, Chinese defense budget growing up more than 10% in a year annually. And if you look at North Korea, they continuously develop the nuclear and ballistic missile. So in a sense, we are not sure whether this is enough or not. And the other good news is this defense budget is now transforming to put more priority for air and maritime assets. With the National Defense Program Guideline, National Defense Program Guideline is a 10 years time frame strategic document, and it has 10 years future as objective for structure. And based on that strategy, the government released a medium-term defense programming. That is a 5-year time frame shopping plan. And this 5-year time frame shopping plan, traditionally, that MTDPs, when Japanese defense budget, if you look at the contents, 40% of defense budget is for maritime self-defense force, Navy. 35% is for ground self-defense force, Army. 25% is for Air Force, Air Self-Defense Force. But the new MTDP, which started in 2014, switched the share of the services. The top priority is continue to be Navy. They got a 40% budget, but Air Force got 35% budget, and the Army has 25% budget. So this change. This is only a procurement. If you look at the personnel cost, the figure would be changed. But if you look at the procurement, the share of Air Force, Air Self-Defense Force, is now bigger than Ground Self-Defense Force, mainly because to buy F-35. But this reflects the strategic documents, strategic thought to prioritize air and maritime superiority. So this is a part of what Japan is doing to counter anti-accessory readiness threat. And the last, I'd like to talk about alliance response. as broadly known, now Japan and the US is discussing to revise the defense guideline. Defense guideline is a kind of a foundational document to promote the actual operation planning between both countries' military officers. To set the political framework for military professionals. This guideline is very important document. And of course, defense guideline is not against specific country. So not against China, not against North Korea, just against contingency. So just to strengthen deterrence. That is the objective defense guideline. But anyway, that kind of new alliance document will come soon, maybe 1 or 2 months later. And it has two big objectives. The first one is to build a seamless structure from the peacetime to gray zone, from gray zone to contingency. So now we need, traditionally the strategist or military planner just looking at the contingency, but looking at the current East Asia situation, we need to look more about we need to have more broader spectrum from peacetime, gray zone, and the contingency. And U.S. Japan Alliance is a unique alliance compared to NATO or US ROK alliance. That means U.S. and Japan Alliance doesn't have single integrated command structure. So this alliance assumes these two militaries coordinate together without single commander. So this has big challenge for especially the seamless response. Under the 1997 guidelines, before the new guidelines, the guideline was signed in 1997, which was 2 years after the first Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis. And that 1997 format has assumed to have some kind of bilateral coordination mechanism, that is institutionalized coordination mechanism between US and Japan, but that is not permanent body. You need a specific decision to activate that mechanism. And the prerequisite to start to activate that mechanism is very high. And very, very, very good example is even in the 2011 earthquake, self-defense force mobilized 100,000 personnel, and the U.S. mobilized aircraft carriers, Marine Corps, significant military assets. And U.S. and Japan conducted very, very big combined operation. However, even that case, 1997 guideline-based coordination body could not be activated because that was assumed to start in case of the defense of Japan situation or situation area surrounding Japan, basically that is the Korean Peninsula conflict. So this kind of very high bar coordination body would not be work for the contemporary security environment. So we need to have much more institutionalized or permanent coordination body from the peacetime to treat gray zone or the contingency in effective manner. So this is one of the big aspect of the new defense guideline, I think. And the second one is it will introduce a new operation domain. As I said, the previous guideline was signed in 1997. 1997, do you remember what kind of internet did you use? That was dial-up, and then you don't have movie, and no social networking. So completely different world in terms of cyber domain. So at that time, nobody thinks of cyber as a defense issue. So but now it's different. So we need to include the cyber. And space as well. At that time, of course, the U.S. used the space assets for operations, but just U.S. Now that is more competing domain, and competitive domain by emerging countries. So the implication of security is completely different compared to the 15 years ago. And missile defense, even missile defense, the US-Japan R&D cooperation started in 1998, and Japan started to deploy missile defense in 2003. So in 1997, there was no operational cooperation of missile defense between US and Japan. And so this kind of new operational area is the other big topic for defense cooperation. And you may notice that I don't talk about counter anti-accessory area denial posture of the alliance, and that again will continue to be a kind of homework to improve our posture. Resiliency, just like Kotani-san said in this morning, resiliency, hardening, or dispersal. How do we combine that? How do we use civilian assets, or how do we use out of Japan area? So this kind of thing need to continue to be discussed. And I think in that sense, the role of the think tank community is, I think, very, very big. Thanks. I stop here.
Good afternoon. My name is Maeda, and I am very honored to have the opportunity to introduce my view on rise of China and nature of China's threat. Okay. I heard some people claim that China isn't a threat, but by seeing China's recent activities in South and East China Sea, that is very dangerous, might invoke the collision with other countries, deserve to call it threat. But both Japanese and the US government are very cautious to state China as a threat. For the government, it is right attitude to avoid using hostile terms to maintain the policy options as much as possible. But I'm not from the government, so I omit using evasive way of the talking. How to respond to the rise of China and neutralize its threat is very important and hot issue. The reason why people assume China as threat varies from person to person, age to age. In Japan, also, the context of China's threat varies across the ages. Next. After defeated in the World War II, many Japanese had a sense of guilty toward China. There was no perception recognizing China as a threat. Even one of the most powerful prime minister post-war Japan, Shigeru Yoshida, he was strong anti-communist, but he didn't assume China as a threat. He said we shouldn't see China and Soviet Union as monoliths. And he said, because before the war, he has experience to work in China, mainland China. He said, I believe the communism doesn't fit the Chinese culture. So anyway, but after the one of the most, in 1964, there happens a big event that shocked Japanese. That is China's success as a nuclear detonation. And that caused a serious discussion among Japanese security experts and policymakers about how Japan should respond. Some claimed that Japan should develop the nuclear weapons as well, but after considering the international and domestic situations, Japan decided not to become a nuclear power. Alternatively, Japan chose to make the solid U.S.-Japan Alliance, protected by nuclear umbrella by the U.S., and maintains the economic and scientific basis enough to be nuclear capable nation. Next, please. Japan and China normalized the relation in 1972, and China pressed for the open reform policy since late 1970s. Japan supported China's development. In 1992, China declared a law on the territorial sea and the contiguous zone, and stated the Senkaku, in Chinese, Diaoyu, and the disputed islands in South China Sea as Chinese territory. That is very ambitious and problematic declaration, but in those days, only security experts were alarmed. Generally, it didn't make a big issue in Japan. At the time, Japanese government tried to take China in international community after Tiananmen incident. I tried to persuade other Western countries that engaging China would be more constructive and realistic. In those days, in Japan, China's threat rather meant the concerns that China might fall in disorder at home. Next. Sorry, by the previous one. In late 20s, 2000, not only China's military buildup, but also its assertive foreign policy has raised a great concern in Japan. Before them, many Japanese worried about uncertainty of China's future, but at the same time had some expectation that China would become the country which attaches more importance on international law, peace and cooperative relationship with neighboring countries. But contrary to expectation, China has come to show more assertive diplomacy, use its power unilaterally to change status quo so far. In short, both with intention and capability, China raises serious concerns for the peace and stability in the region. Next, please. And China's growing military capability has created concerns. Until when current pace of military buildup be able to continue? And what is the ultimate goal of China's military buildup? Or is there a possibility that China's military power surpass the US? And we need to understand the nature of China's threat correctly, because vague feeling of anxiety prompt fears and impeding us from making a calm judgment. I suppose that the possibility of China's military capability surpassing the US is very low. This morning, Kotani-san is really like joking. But China has a various domestic, and furthermore, China has a various domestic problems, especially the demographic pressure that has posed a big challenge to Chinese future. This picture is problem. This data is a little too old, but shows the GDP per capita when the population bonus ends. I picked up the Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, China, Malaysia. And as you see, compared to other countries, China's per capita GDP is much lower. This data is a bit old one, so data calculated the Chinese per capita GDP is about 10,000, but actually last year China's GDP per capita is 12,000 US dollar. But China, so this point, China's China shows us some little much better result, but if we see the birth rate in China's birth rate, this is much worse than we predicted. So anyway, China's faces very difficult problem. That hasn't changed. Next, please. China has stuck with many problems at home. Probably it is difficult to maintain straightaway growth. If Chinese leaders can implement necessary political and economic reform steadily, China might be able to come through this situation, but it is really a big challenge. So it is often pointed out that China faces the danger of falling into middle income trap, but some demographer says we should rather call it middle income cliff for Chinese case. Next, please. Even though it's highly unlikely that China's military capability would be able to surpass the US, China also has a competitive advantage over the US in Asia-Pacific region. There's a physical distance from Asian countries. Even though China's power is smaller than the U.S., its influence to other Asian countries might surpass the U.S. So, as China achieves economic growth, it becomes the biggest economic partner for most of the Asian countries, while they still most of the Asian countries rely on the U.S. in the security area. But if China continues military buildup, even before China's military power catches up America, its influence, power projection in the region might be able to take over the U.S. The left picture shows both the military and the economic power the U.S. covers surpass the influence of the China. The left one, the U.S. power, total power doesn't change. China, yes, grow up, but still doesn't catch up the U.S. But this shows that economically, that China's influence already surpassed the U.S. But military, still the U.S., the influence is over. But if China's military power, the line is up, even China's power doesn't catch up the U.S. Even in the military, they have some balance point. They catch up the balance point. So we can't limit it to the Asia-Pacific region. So we can't be too optimistic. But the U.S. has built an asset that China doesn't have. That's the alliance network and the U.S. troops in the region. So the allies of the U.S., of course Japan also, should try to push up the line, U.S. line, and total U.S. power, increase total U.S. power. Next, please. And currently, as Takahashi-san previously introduced, current Abe administration is proceeding a series of security policy reforms since its birth, 2012. It is a big step for Japan's post-war security policy and contribute to strengthen the U.S. Japan Alliance. Next, please. As the new guidelines, we refer to cooperation for cybersecurity, and that also that Takahashi-san referred. And it is very important area, but in Japan, the legislation relevant to cybersecurity is quite undeveloped and need to be tackled with at once. For example, related to cyber and the defense issue, what are the necessary conditions to invoke the right of self-defense or collective self-defense about the cyber attack? And who or which organ would judge the existence of cyber attack and authorize to take countermeasures? And what kind of countermeasures can be permitted? This is maybe inside the government they are talking about, but yes, still going on. That's the process. Also in Japan, the experts regarding to cybersecurity is definitely shortage. Japan should put more effort to raise experts who can connect their expertise to to foreign and security policies. Next, please. And cooperation for maritime capability building is already discussed in previous sessions, so I skip this topic. But only I would like to point out that Japan's new development cooperation charter that is set out, released last month, and which is replacing the old ODA charter. Japan's new, that is clarifies the capability building of the military to implement the public welfare or disaster relief is one of the important goals for Japan's ODA. That makes it easier for Japan to support the maritime capability enhancement of other countries. Next. So finally, I would like to point out that the redefinition of the U.S.-Japan Alliance and the sharing China strategy are still necessary. Chinese assertiveness helped Japan and the U.S. spear those discussions. Of course, through the revising the guidelines, U.S. and Japan must have related talks though. As U.S. Japan Alliance is quite reliable and time-proven relationship, still we can't deny it also includes some fragility. For example, when Democratic Party of Japan took power in Japan 2009, and then Prime Minister Hatoyama announced his new idea on security and foreign policy, the U.S. officials carefully avoided giving negative remarks, but were anxious about DPJ's policy. And on the other hand, when China proposed the idea of new model of great power relations and U.S.-China relationship, and it seemed that the U.S. somehow agreed to use the term, which made Japanese feel uneasiness. So China often takes, and the Chinese tactics, China often takes a dividing policy to weaken the opponent coalition. I name it punishment and rewards, or this is unique to China, public flogging. Make an example for tactics. The public flogging tactics is picking up one country among the opposing groups, takes very harsh policy towards that one, and meanwhile shows tolerant policy to others. So, for example, France became the target when Western countries criticized human rights abuse in Tibet in 2008, and lately so does the UK. In ASEAN, Philippines became the target of the punishment. So balancing the assertive China and simultaneously support its stable growth is not an easy task. Japan and US need to strengthen the relationship, share the comprehensive China strategy, and meet long-term vision of the order in the region. Both countries need more patience and prudence to achieve the peaceful power transition and establish the rules-based order in the Asia-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Ms. Chanlett-Avery.
Thank you. I think I have the dubious distinction of being the last speaker and the last panel of a Friday conference when everybody probably wants to be watching basketball anyway. But so bear with me. I'll be fairly brief here. I first have to offer the disclaimer that anything I say here, these are my personal views. They do not represent the views of the U.S. Congress or the Congressional Research Service, because CRS has no views, as you may know. I think that my colleagues have done a good job of focusing on some of the important security reforms to modernize the alliance and pointing to new areas like cyber and space. I'm going to give my thoughts on sort of the overall health of the alliance, highlight some of the upcoming opportunities to demonstrate its response to the changing environment in East Asia, and then focus on the alliance's sort of joint efforts to engage the broader region. I think that overall, the exchange between U.S. and Japanese officials in the last several years on the state of the alliance has been very robust, very multi-layered, sort of having the right conversations about how to adjust the alliance in light of China's military modernization. Interoperability has been significantly enhanced, and the geographic emphasis has really shifted to Japan's Southwest Islands. Importantly, political atmospherics have also been positive, particularly President Obama's visit to Japan last April and his explicit support for some of Japan's defense reform efforts. In the next several months, I think there are some sort of key decisions and opportunities to indicate how far the alliance has come in harmonizing operations and its strategic goals, as well as point out what remains to be done. As mentioned earlier, the most prominent goalpost is going to be the release of the updated mutual defense guidelines that sort of really guide defense cooperation. Expected to be released this spring, this document may help to clarify how both sides view key issues, such as the treatment of gray zone conflicts, the importance of continuing the extended deterrence dialogue, the implications of Japan's relaxation of its arms export ban, and probably most crucially, and currently at least, how the changed interpretation of Japan's constitution to allow for the exercise of collective self-defense will affect alliance operations. Beyond this document, which will get plenty of attention in the next couple months, and really focuses on sort of the medium to long-term challenges of the alliance, there are more immediate concerns to also pay attention to. Of course, one of them is how the implementing legislation in the Japanese Diet is actually treated and what adjustments are made. And there's also another round of host nation support negotiations coming up this year. These are always contentious, trying to figure out how to share the burden of hosting U.S. troops. And it's a possibility that Japan may balk at some of U.S. demands, given that it has put more resources, modestly more, but more resources into its own capabilities in recent years. I think on the international side, this is very important because Japan's international outreach efforts have really complemented the U.S. rebalance or pivot strategy in Asia. That their efforts together, Japan and the United States, are working to build more of a regional consensus based on international rules and international law. I think these efforts are trying to achieve the right balance between reassuring and engaging China, offering positive incentives for good behavior, but also, of course, to dissuade China from any destabilizing actions and reinforce strong deterrence measures. ASEAN has obviously been a particular focus for the U.S. and Japan to build up that organization's institutions and its capacity, as well as to reinforce solidarity among its members. Japan has increased its security links significantly with the Philippines and with Vietnam, and more recently with Indonesia. These efforts are made possible largely by the relaxation of Japan's arms export ban and by fairly aggressive diplomatic outreach. Prime Minister Abe visited all 10 ASEAN countries in his first year in office. Defense cooperation, it sounds like this was touched upon earlier before I joined the conference, has focused on maritime issues, military training, HADR, and the provision of patrol vessels and other equipment. Japan's also initiated several discussions with these countries in joining existing multilateral exercises in which the U.S. also participates. And this dovetails really nicely with U.S. security cooperation efforts in the Asia-Pacific. The risk to some of the approaches in ASEAN is that Japan may be seen as working primarily and most significantly with countries that are already somewhat suspicious of China and don't have the strongest relationships, and that could increase Beijing's sense of encirclement. Japan's growing partnership with Australia, which is probably its strongest defense relationship outside of the United States, has been, I think, largely welcomed by the United States as a way to develop stronger security networks among its allies and its partners in order to maintain peace in the region. Trilateral ties between the U.S., Japan, and Australia are also developing at a pretty high level, as evidenced by the trilateral joint statement among Obama, Abbott, and Prime Minister Abe in November of last year. Japan's efforts to develop more institutionalized cooperation with India is slightly less developed than that with Australia, but it also supports this U.S. emphasis on building security relations among its allies and partners in the region. It seems that under Modi, efforts to expand cooperation have accelerated somewhat. It's focusing mostly on defense equipment and technology, as well as joint training, and it seems to be coming simultaneously at the moment when Washington is trying to upgrade its relations with Delhi as well. So that works well together. I just also want to point out, in contrast to, I think, what are these largely positive developments in terms of international outreach in the alliance, there are a couple of more challenging areas that bear mentioning here. Those are with South Korea and with Russia, although for very, very different reasons. Of course, this is a very, very well-tread topic here, but I just want to underscore, of course, that Tokyo and Seoul's poor relations have been a source of perennial frustration for U.S. defense planners who have been very anxious for years to have their two treaty allies work together to reinforce U.S. interests in the region. The relationship has been particularly chilly under the current leaders and really represents, I think, one of the major challenges for the U.S.-Japan Alliance. All the trilateral mechanisms that could be put in place are very much thwarted when we don't have these basic security agreements. And I think most of you probably remember that the AXA and GSOMIA agreements fell apart really at the last minute in 2012. Although there have been very modest efforts, such as an MOU, a trilateral MOU between the three capitals last year, these efforts to really revitalize trilateral cooperation currently I don't find very promising in the current political environment. I think the U.S. also has some concerns, quiet concerns, about Japan's efforts to enhance its relations with Russia. That was a campaign that was underway at the beginning of Abe's term, but has certainly been slowed by Russian actions in the Ukraine. Japan did sign on to the other Western sanctions against Russia in the wake of that aggression. But it also had been on pace to really increase its relationship. It held 2+2 defense talks with Russia in 2013. Sort of new energy cooperation plans were being hatched. I think that if Tokyo moves to relax some of those sanctions or develop its ties further with Moscow, I think that could possibly be a source of tension in the alliance as the U.S. leads efforts to isolate Moscow diplomatically. I think I will end there and see if our audience is still alive. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank this panel collectively for a very fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your wisdom, your insights, and the scholarship that you shared with us today. It's truly a pleasure to have you here. Now, this is the real fun part where we can ask questions, right? So I'll ask the first question, and that is, first I'll make the observation, and then I'll ask the question. It strikes me that we're here today because the balance of military power in the Asia-Pacific region is shifting, and it's shifting in a way that is not favorable to the interests of the United States. It's not favorable to the interests of Japan, and it's not favorable to the interests of regional stability and peace. And that's why I think now more than ever, it's important that we talk about alliances and security partnerships. And so I'd like to ask the question, how do you see, each of you, how do you see the U.S. rebalance strategy to Asia? How do you see it performing so far? Do you think it's ambitious enough? Or are we just behind the curve and we're trying to play catch up at this point and we've really lost the initiative? So that's the first question.
That is, I think, when U.S. started to start a rebalance, this question was continuously asked. And I think the answer would be, I think, the same. At first, U.S. has never left from Asia. So U.S. rebalance doesn't mean U.S. return to Asia. And, what U.S. did, especially I think after 2010, when South China Sea or East China Sea problem is, realized, I think, what the U.S. has done was not so bad, both for China and for Korean Peninsula, and, of course, one of the very typical criticism to U.S. rebalance is no significant military augmentation, military asset augmentation to the region. But, compared to, for example, Europe or, Central Asia, the military presence in this region means the Asia-Pacific, is relatively good situation. And so I think, I can give if I give a grade, that is kind of A- or B+ accents.
Okay. Oh, yes. Some Japanese or some Asian countries said they welcome the rebalance when the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton declared the rebalance of policy. This is pretty welcomed. But later, because U.S. is very busy to the Middle East or other areas, so they said maybe their Obama administration is not so serious about the rebalance policy. But I think it's too harsh to the U.S. U.S. has to take care of many things. So, one lately, it's not complaint, but China complains about the rebalance policy, and they said, well, because friction is because of U.S. rebalance policy, is the friction occurred. But it's very nonsense because Obama administration, I think in the history, it's most attach importance to the stable relationship with Sino-U.S. relationship. From the beginning, Obama administration, there's restraint policy. They don't criticize China so much and try to maintain the good relationship, but China became more and more assertive. But still, China criticized the U.S. That's the U.S. cause the problem, and I think this is China reverse the result and reason. But lately, some American scholars said maybe rebalance policy didn't care China's feelings so much. I think maybe this is a diplomatic way, but I think this is too nice and too kind to China.
I'll just add that, I think that the U.S. rebalance strategy, because of our own fiscal constraints and political constraints here, may have been under-resourced in some ways, but it's a long-term process. And you can't really expect sort of immediate results. But what will, I think, give a real foundation to this rebalance effort, of course, would be if the TPP agreement was passed. And it's a little bit hard to give any sort of a report card on the rebalance strategy before we see what the fate is of that agreement.
Okay. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for very patiently, and your patience is very much appreciated today. Sir, you get the first question.
John Schuessler again from Johns Hopkins University. We touched very briefly on U.S. constraints with respect to the economy and defense budgets. I was wondering if our Japanese friends would care to comment about the long-term viability of their strategy, given the constraints that the Japanese have with respect to their current budget debt and the ability to increase defense budgets over the long term, given that.
At first, I think I want to talk two different things. One thing is, how do we view the U.S. defense budget implication? The thing is, my thought is, I can be cautiously optimistic about the future. The reason why I can be optimistic is, the current U.S. defense budget is about slightly less than $550 billion. And that is about $150 billion lower than 2010, but $200 billion bigger than 1999. So in a sense, U.S. procured many things since 2010, 2000 to now, like F-22, 180 F-22, more than 40 Aegis ships, and 170 C-17, and then missile defense system. So these things, at least in coming 10 years, 15 years, may hopefully 20 years, these things would have very significant deterrent implication. So in a sense, I think I can be optimistic. But the reason why I say I need to be cautious is, not just the U.S., including Japan or other Western countries. These countries' air warfare capability, future air warfare capabilities now relies on F-35. So the program management issue of F-35 is critical, could have very critical implication for the alliance. That's not the matter of the money, but for the when it comes and how many is procured or how many is produced. So these issues must be, the implication of these things should not be underestimated. So this is one of my thought. And the second thing is, the second reason I need to be cautious is just like Maeda-san said, U.S. need to look at the global. So, sometimes you may need to share more resources for Middle East or, other areas rather than Asia Pacific, that kind of situation can happen in any timing. So in a sense, I think my position is still cautiously optimistic. And about Japanese defense budget, the current Japanese defense budget is the share of the GDP is, I think, 0.92 or 93%. So in a sense, my thought is 10% increase to achieve the GDP 1% budget. That I don't think that is not too ambitious. However, looking at the other budget issues, just like science and technology, or public infrastructure, or social security, and now defense budget is growing up, but the other part of the defense, defense budget items are also growing up, and even under the current situations, it's very difficult to make the social security budget flat. And to increase defense budget, that is politically very difficult. I think that is universal truth for democratic countries. So in a sense, I cannot say Japan has Japanese budget situation is enough flexible to increase to 10%, 10% increase to achieve the GDP 1%. So.
Other questions, Scott.
Scott Harold of the Rand Corporation. A question for Emma and Sugio. If you could talk to each other, I want to ask you to talk to your counterpart. What's the one low-hanging fruit that you think your side would like to see the other do in the defense and security realm? And then if you could wave your magic wand and get one capability, arrangement, something that you think probably is too far beyond today, but you'd like to aim at it for the longer run, what would that be? Again, what's the one low-hanging fruit you'd like to see the U.S. side do? Longer term, down the road, what's the one big thing that you'd say, boy, if the U.S. could do that, I know probably today they can't, but we really, on the Japan side, wish they could. Same for you, Emma.
Great question.
You want me to start? Low-hanging fruits. First of all, it just has to do with how this collective self-defense legislation is actually crafted. I mean, what concessions are being made and how restrictive that actually ends up being. There's a universe of options within that, depending on how that's passed. And I don't know enough about the internal deliberations going on between the LDP and Komeito right now to exactly say which of those I want, but I think it's certainly ripe. If not low-hanging, and we'll see how that process ends up. The other thing that is more in the diplomatic realm, and maybe not so ripe, but as I mentioned, just getting to a degree of functional cooperation with South Korea is of tremendous importance for the U.S. It's, I mean, we talked about this for years now, but it just seems like the equipment and the strategic priorities are aligned enough that there could be a lot that we could do with be a lot more convincing in all of our efforts to press this particular agenda in East Asia. I'll stop there.
I think this says the legislation issue is, I think, the very important one. And if I say more like regional strategy perspective, U.S. and China, I think both two countries had some kind of similar tendency. That is, Sino-U.S. relations could be treated as purely bilateral context. I mean, so new type of relations or responsible stakeholder like things, sometimes, China definitely has that characteristic, and the U.S. also has that. And but the reality is China, because of the global rise of China, they have regional implication, and because U.S. is an Asian power, so you have regional stakes. So many times, the third country issues affect U.S.-China bilateral relations, and sometimes you too forget about that. And So, how to say, to realize, third country issue can have a very, how to say, serious implication for your country's relations. And so that means, now US and China cannot define the characteristic of bilateral relations by yourselves. So I think, keeping that mind, keep that reality in mind is, I think, the very, very important thing.
Michael Chun.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michael Chen. I'm just a freelance researcher. I have kind of 3 questions. The first one, coming off of Ms. Maeda's remarks about China kind of blaming the rebalance as their justification for aggression, whereas clearly, even before the rebalancing policy, they had already been acting that way. So it seems like they're going to act that way no matter what. And so my question is kind of, well, if they're going to keep acting that way with rebalance, which is building up capabilities to deter China's aggression, if they're going to keep acting assertively anyways, kind of what's the end game? Like, is there going to be a point when China finally decides that like the cost of aggression has gone to a level that's too high, or will they just keep building up no matter what? And my second question is kind of coming off of Emma's remarks about U.S. seeing Japan-Korea ties as very important, as something that needs to be improved. And I know that when Abe and Ms. Park just came into power, there was some hope that that would happen, seeing as they were both considered more defense hawks. And then quickly, we realized that not only were they defense hawks, they were also pretty nationalist, so they didn't get along. So what is the U.S. role in this? Should there be, how active has that role been, and should it be more active, or is kind of the best solution to wait for a next leader and hope for the best? And the third question is probably to all of you. What role, if any, does Taiwan have to play in U.S.-Japan Security Alliance? Thanks.
The first album is Rebalance. Previously I said China criticized the rebalance is rebalance policy because of the rebalance is Asia Pacific became unstable is nonsense. But I imagine why, because Chinese first time I heard that rhetoric, I thought really Chinese use it as said it as rhetoric, but later I knew they seriously believe that way. So I imagine why Chinese people say like that. Asia is China's. If U.S. doesn't intervene, China can maintain this area stable as China's way. So U.S. just do something unnecessary things. So this region becomes more unstable. That is probably Chinese people's way of thinking. And but until when this tendencies grows, that depends on China's economic growth, I think. Still, coming 10 years, now Chinese government said a new normal and their economic growth speed is slow down, but probably still keeps 6 or 7% coming 10 years, pretty high. So, but in domestic politics, the social, people's public complaint piled up. So this coming decade, I think, is most dangerous or most problematic for neighboring countries, because it's highly possible there is a possibility that CCP leaders they try to divert their public's eye to the domestic problems, take more assertive foreign policy. But later, I think probably Chinese people will notice the biggest problem for them exists inside China, not outside. So maybe in the future they again return to the kind of keeps low profile policy. Is that a possibility? When keeps not low profile, try to avoid the confrontation. Let's see.
In terms of the U.S. role in mediating between South Korea and Japan, I think it's been quiet but consistent, and I think that's pretty appropriate. I don't think that it's really the U.S.'s place to actually publicly referee these disputes. I mean, and you see just in these little mini controversies that erupt all the time, any indication of the U.S. shading in one direction or other, sort of erupts into a firestorm in one capital or the other. I mean, Wendy Sherman's comments a couple weeks ago caused sort of a firestorm in Seoul, and the U.S. reaction to Abe's visit to Yasukuni was, had a similar effect in Tokyo a few years ago or a year and a half ago. So I think it probably would be doomed to defeat. Certainly, if you had any track one efforts at that. In terms of the prospects for any sort of a warming of relation under these two leaders, in some ways, right, there's this opportunity because they both sort of proven their, quote unquote nationalist credentials. So there's a lot of maybe wishful thinking out there that, we have the Nixon to China moments since both of these leaders have their bona fides. I haven't seen a lot of indications that either are inclined to do that, but maybe they'll surprise us. And with Japan-ROK relations, there's such a cycle, an annual cycle of controversies. There's sort of like the textbook season, and then there's like Dokdo Takeshima season, and unfortunately, it sets you up in this pattern where it's really difficult to break out of it.
And then the final question on Taiwan.
And Taiwan, yes, has a big meaning in future current because so far in East China Sea, especially South China Sea, we can't stop the China's unilateral activity. Even there is we still so far we can't find out a good way to stop China's unilateral activity, and China seems upper hand in the foreign policy so far, but there is one thing China can do control well is the Taiwan issues, or Hong Kong and the Hong Kong problem. From Chinese perspective, why they deepen the economic relationship, and Taiwan people got a big economic interest. Why they still protest China? And Hong Kong is the same. So, seeing China's economic power have the leverage in this region, but in Taiwan that doesn't work well. So, this is so we should protect Taiwan. I haven't find out some specific way, but this is very important to protect Taiwan's people's their sense of democracy, or their real feeling that doesn't want to be united with mainland China, and of course we don't want to the very tense relationship. But anyway, probably next presidential election in next year in 2006, probably DPP will take power, and we will see. Of course, this poses a big challenge to mainland China too. So we hope that 2-3 years tension will not occur, but very important to protect Taiwan people's value. It is, I think, to maintain or of course. Maintain or protect our value or more liberal order in this region, or democracy in the region is for us, even not only for Taiwan, the other allies is very important thing, I think.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Sir.
Hi, Steve Winters, local researcher. I'd like to direct this to Hiroko-san. Since you mentioned Hatoyama here in your talk, could you give us a little more background on exactly the role that Hatoyama plays now, continuously? He's very popular in China, obviously. And also, some people here think that the departure of Hatoyama and the changeover in the leadership of the DPJ was more complicated than maybe it appeared in the public, and that the U.S. had some influence in that. Just, you know, maybe you know more about that. And of course, there are other examples. There was a delegation of top leaders from DPJ who've been in Washington, D.C. since Abe has been in power, and I met with them, others did. They said, we're bringing a message. No, sorry, Abe doesn't represent the feelings of the majority of people in Japan. And then you have Murayama, the famous Murayama statement. The last I checked, a month or two ago, he was over leading a trade delegation in China and warmly welcomed by the Chinese. So, you know, you spoke about the fragility and just mentioned one, but what about these figures? What's going on? Is it, can you just ignore all of these factors?
The one thing is former Prime Minister Hatoyama. In Japan, really, people think he is a very strange guy. Even his real brother called him alien. In Japan, really, nobody really, how to say, take him as serious. He doesn't have any political influence. But I think, so really, Mr. Hatoyama is troublemaker. For most of Japanese think he is a troublemaker. But I think for Prime Minister Abe or LDP, maybe should appreciate him. Because LDP is now they got they won the election in huge a big win. That's thanks to the Japanese public's disappointment toward DPJ was too big. So maybe not only me, Takahashi-san. Just
I have no comment. But if I could just follow up, would you say the same thing about Ozawa? Because we can assume that when Hatoyama was there, Ozawa was really the power in that party. And it's quite argued by many experts that if Ozawa had actually gotten control in Japan, say the way Abe currently has control, the whole relation between Japan and China would be entirely different than it is under the current direction. But, so is Ozawa another space cadet? Is that what you're going to say?
Mr. Ozawa, yes, before he was a very powerful politician, but because the DPJ didn't, DPJ's governance was really disappointed for the many Japanese publics, and Ozawa's way is to, traditional. To old-style Japanese politics. So maybe it's for young generations, for Japanese publics, his way is to, lack of the transparency. He's trust to Machiavellism. Anyway, he's not popular anymore, and yes, this is true in the. DPJ only holds the power 3 years, but still Japan, I think, going on the process of the change of the post-war period. 70 years since end of World War II, 70 years Japan's constitution and security policy and many economic policy hasn't changed a lot. Now we need some reform.
Very good. Final question from the gentleman in the back who's been waiting very patiently with the black hat on.
Hi, I'm Zhao. I'm a student of Defense and Security Studies at Rutgers University. I have a question for the panel. Just with rebalancing and as future security dilemmas might arise, how optimistic are both sides in preventing a Cuban Missile-like crisis due to all of the military activity in the disputed region?
Could you say that thing? Could you speak more loudly?
I'm sorry. I was just wondering, with the rebalancing and as future security dilemmas might arise, How optimistic are both sides, the U.S. and Japan, in its efforts to prevent a Cuban Missile-like crisis due to all of the military activity in the region?
You talked about the security dilemma, I think. One of the preconditions of security dilemma is two players looked at each other's. And these players' decision-making is basically made by the consideration to other players' behavior. And looking at the Chinese, for example, defense budget increase back to about 20 years ago, during that time, Japanese defense budget was almost flat. And at the same time, in the US, Chinese defense budget increased more than 10% in annual terms. So, or in case of North Korea as well, North Korea continuously develops a nuclear and ballistic missile. Regardless of Japanese defense budget was flat. So in this sense, there is between Japan and China, there is no, Chinese decision making about defense policy is independent of what Japan is doing. So in a sense, this is not security dilemma situation. China is doing for their own reason, not looking at Japan. And so I don't think framing the regional situation as security dilemma is, proper way to look at that. And, but at the same time, as you said, how to avoid the crisis, that is important thing, regardless of security dilemma or not. And so in a sense, good news is both Japanese side and Chinese side and US side seek to have, emergency communication link procedure. Now, Japan and China basically agreed to start that. And now we just need a final green light from the political side. So such kind of, effort to reduce the crisis management is very important. Looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, US and USSR didn't have such kind of communication channel. They need to do in the United Nations or Switzerland as other channels. But to have the direct channel will have the significant role to deal with the actual situation, I think.
Well, thank you very much to our panel. It has been a fascinating discussion and one that is very much appreciated. Thank you all so much for coming so far to be here today. And thank you to all in the audience as well. It is truly a pleasure to have you all here, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks again.